The night is quiet, but not calm. You're standing on the edge of something vast. The sea, the plan, the lie. Around you, men move like shadows, whispering orders that may or may not be real. Rubber tanks rest in English fields, painted to fool eyes from the sky. Somewhere across the channel, the enemy watches and believes every word. You can taste the salt in the air, the fear on your tongue, the weight of secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Or maybe, which image stayed with you the most as you listened? Now, get comfortable. Let the noise of today fade away. You're listening to echoes of war. Shadows on the shore. The beaches of Normandy today are quiet. The waves lap gently against the sand. Children build sandcastles where tanks once burned. Seagulls wheel overhead where dive bombers once screamed. It is difficult, standing here in the peace of the present, to imagine the chaos of June 6, 1944. To imagine the smoke, the fire, the terrible roar of war. Yet behind the bravery of the men who stormed these beaches lay another, hidden battlefield. A battlefield of shadows and illusions. D-Day was the greatest amphibious invasion in history, but it was also the greatest deception. 4 years, Allied planners labored not only to build armies, but to build phantoms, fake divisions, fake tanks, fake radio signals, and even fake generals. Their goal was not simply to land in France, but to make Adolf Hitler believe, with absolute certainty, that the landings at Normandy were only a diversion. The story of D-Day cannot be told by looking at Omaha Beach alone. To understand why the Germans were unprepared on the morning of June 6th, we must step back into the shadows, into the secret preparations, the master plans of deception, and the strange cast of double agents, code breakers, and illusionists who helped bring about one of the most decisive victories in modern history. This is the story of how the Allies fooled the Nazis, and how illusion paved the way for liberation. Before we begin, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of history, the ones rarely told in textbooks, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more of these forgotten chapters, and ensures you won't miss the secrets we reveal next. Chapter 1. The Stakes of D-Day. By early 1944, the Second World War had entered its decisive phase. In the east, the Red Army was grinding its way westward, pushing back German forces in a tide of blood and steel. In Italy, Allied armies had opened a new front, but progress was slow, the terrain unforgiving. For Britain and the United States, one truth became unavoidable. If Nazi Germany was to be defeated, a massive assault on Western Europe was necessary. The plan was as audacious as it was terrifying: to land hundreds of thousands of men on the shores of France, establish a beachhead, and drive inland, all against a deeply entrenched enemy who had been preparing for this moment for years. The Atlantic Wall. Hitler believed he was ready. Along the western coast of Europe, stretching from Norway down to the border of Spain, German engineers had constructed what he called the Atlantic Wall. It was an enormous system of fortifications, bunkers, gun emplacements, machine gun nests, and concrete obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft before they reached the shore. Propaganda films depicted it as impenetrable. To German civilians, it was reassurance that no enemy could touch them. To Allied planners, it was a nightmare. Every potential landing site was defended. Every approach threatened annihilation. But Hitler had a blind spot. He could not be strong everywhere at once. The Atlantic Wall was vast, but it was also thinly stretched. Reinforcements would have to be rushed to any invasion site. If the Allies could mislead him, if they could make him defend the wrong beaches, they could create a fatal weakness in his defenses. Choosing Normandy. The decision to land in Normandy was not inevitable. The Pas de Calais, the closest point between Britain and France, was the obvious choice. It was the narrowest part of the English Channel, the most direct route to Germany, and the logical invasion site in the eyes of German planners. Normandy, by contrast, was further away, with fewer ports and more difficult approaches. But that was precisely its advantage. The Germans expected Calais. Normandy, though challenging, offered the chance of surprise. Yet the danger was immense. If the Germans concentrated their armored divisions in Normandy, the invasion could be crushed on the beaches. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, put it bluntly: "If this operation fails, then it is hard to see how we can ever win the war." The need for secrecy. Secrecy became paramount. The Allies could not risk Germany learning the date or location of the invasion. The enemy had spies, reconnaissance planes, and radio intercepts. One leak could doom the operation before it began. But secrecy was not enough. The Allies needed more than silence. They needed noise. They needed to misdirect German eyes, to feed them false information so convincing that even when the invasion began, Hitler would hesitate to believe what he saw. Thus was born Operation Bodyguard, the grand deception plan. As Churchill would later say, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Hitler's convictions. The Allies' greatest asset was, strangely enough, Hitler himself. He was obsessed with Calais. He believed, almost to the point of delusion, that the real invasion must come there. His generals sometimes doubted, but Hitler's conviction was absolute. This gave Allied planners their opportunity. If they could reinforce Hitler's belief, if every scrap of intelligence, every whisper of rumor pointed to Calais, they could ensure that on the morning of June 6th, his armies would be in the wrong place. Setting the stage. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would mean a foothold in Europe, a path to liberation, and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Failure would mean catastrophe, tens of thousands dead, the Allied armies thrown back into the sea, and perhaps years more of war. As Eisenhower prepared his men for the coming storm, the real battle was already being fought, not on the beaches, but in the shadows, in the world of spies, double agents, and phantom armies. The men who planned D-Day understood its risks. General Eisenhower once admitted privately, "Every man who sets foot on those beaches tomorrow will be scared to death, but every man will do his duty." For the soldiers who knew what awaited, the anxiety was heavy. A U.S. paratrooper wrote in his diary the night before, "We will be part of something the world will never forget. If I don't come back, tell my folks I was proud to go." On the German side, propaganda films showed endless fortifications of the Atlantic Wall. Civilians in occupied France were told that any invasion attempt would be futile. One villager near Calais recalled later, "We believed the coast was invincible. Everywhere we saw bunkers and wire. We thought no one could ever land here." But reality was different. The wall looked strong in posters, but along its 1,500 miles, defenses were often thin, incomplete, or manned by exhausted conscripts from Eastern Europe. Chapter 2. Building the Invasion Force. The decision had been made. Normandy was the place. But knowing where to strike was only the beginning. To put an army across the English Channel, the Allies would need to create the largest amphibious invasion force the world had ever seen, and somehow conceal it until the very last moment. The arsenal of democracy. By 1944, the industrial power of the United States was in full swing. American shipyards were launching vessels at a staggering pace. Liberty ships, landing craft, destroyers, tankers. Factories that once produced automobiles now turned out Sherman tanks and jeeps by the thousands. Britain, battered but unbroken, contributed its own resources. Specialized tanks known as Hobart's funnies, ingenious engineering vehicles designed to tackle obstacles on the beaches. Canada, too, played a vital role, supplying men, ships, and logistical support. All told, more than 7,000 ships would be assembled for the invasion. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, and landing craft of every size. This floating armada would carry nearly 156,000 men across the Channel on D-Day itself, with hundreds of thousands more to follow in the weeks ahead. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Behind each figure were challenges that seemed, at times, insurmountable. How do you feed and supply an army once it lands on hostile shores? How do you keep tanks from bogging down in soft sand? How do you move men and material when every port in northern France is under German control? The answers required not just courage, but ingenuity. Mulberry harbors, ports that didn't exist. The problem of ports was among the most serious. Armies cannot survive without a constant flow of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition. Yet the Germans had fortified the major harbors, and the Allies knew they would be heavily defended. So British engineers devised a breathtaking solution. They would build their own harbors. Massive concrete caissons, called phoenixes, were constructed in secrecy and towed across the Channel after D-Day. These formed the backbone of artificial ports, known as mulberry harbors. Floating roadways connected them to the beaches, allowing trucks and tanks to drive directly onto French soil. It was a feat of engineering nearly as important as the landings themselves. Without mulberries, the invasion might have stalled for lack of supplies. With them, the Allies could pour men and material into Normandy at an astonishing rate. Pluto, fuel across the sea. Another invisible lifeline was fuel. Tanks, trucks, and planes could not move without it. To avoid dependence on vulnerable tankers, the Allies developed an extraordinary project, Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Flexible pipelines, coiled onto giant floating drums, were laid across the Channel, pumping gasoline directly from Britain to France. It was a hidden artery of war, ensuring that the invasion force could keep advancing long after the beaches were secured. Training for the impossible. But equipment alone could not win the day. Men had to be trained for the brutal task ahead. Across Britain, villages and coastlines became rehearsal grounds. Soldiers practiced amphibious assaults again and again, storming beaches under simulated fire, learning to coordinate infantry, armor, and air support. One such rehearsal, Exercise Tiger, ended in tragedy when German E-boats attacked a convoy in April 1944, killing more than 700 American servicemen. The disaster was hushed up at the time, but it served as a grim reminder of the risks. War, even in preparation, was unforgiving. Eisenhower and Montgomery, the commanders. At the top stood General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Calm, diplomatic, and determined, Eisenhower held together a coalition of sometimes clashing personalities: American, British, Canadian, Free French. His task was not just military, it was political, balancing egos, priorities, and national pride. Alongside him, General Bernard Montgomery commanded the ground forces. Montgomery insisted on meticulous planning and sought to simplify the invasion scheme. Where others argued for multiple complex maneuvers, Montgomery wanted a single, overwhelming blow. His influence shaped the final plan: landings on 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, supported by airborne assaults inland. The scale of secrecy. With so many men and so much equipment involved, secrecy seemed impossible. Entire counties of southern England were transformed into vast camps. Roads were clogged with convoys of tanks under camouflage netting. Fields became depots for ammunition and fuel. The skies buzzed with aircraft, the seas with ships. And yet, the secret held. Soldiers were often confined to their camps in the final weeks, forbidden to contact home. Letters were censored. Movement was restricted. The enemy must not learn where or when the blow would fall. Still, secrecy alone was not enough. German reconnaissance planes flew over Britain, their cameras capturing images of harbors crammed with ships. Radio traffic spiked as units prepared to move. No matter how well the Allies tried to conceal their efforts, the sheer scale of the buildup could not be hidden. This was where deception became not just useful, but essential. The Allies would let the Germans see the armies, but not the right ones. They would feed them information, but not the truth. They would build a force so vast that even as the real invasion fleet prepared for Normandy, a phantom invasion force appeared to gather elsewhere. Operation Neptune, the invasion plan. The assault itself, codenamed Operation Neptune, was the naval component of the larger plan known as Operation Overlord. Neptune would deliver the assault troops to the beaches. Overlord would carry the campaign through France and into Germany. The landings were designed with brutal precision. At dawn, waves of bombers and naval guns would pound German defenses. Then landing craft would churn toward the beaches, each carrying soldiers packed tightly, seasick and tense. Behind them came tanks, engineers, and supplies. Overhead, fighters and bombers would provide cover. Inland, paratroopers would seize bridges and road junctions, preventing German reinforcements from rushing to the beaches. It was a plan of staggering complexity. Every unit had its role, every timetable its risks, and all of it depended on surprise. Fear and doubt. For the men at the top, the responsibility was crushing. Eisenhower carried a slip of paper in his wallet, a draft statement in case the invasion failed. In it, he took full blame, writing that the troops had done their best, but that the operation had not succeeded. The uncertainty was real. No one could guarantee success. The Channel's weather was unpredictable. German defenses were strong. Casualty estimates ran high. Some feared that thousands might die on the beaches without securing even a foothold. And yet, despite the doubts, the invasion moved forward. By late spring of 1944, the Great Armada was assembled. The men were ready, the ships fueled, the equipment prepared. But would it work? Would the Germans be caught off guard, or would they be waiting in force? The answer lay not just in the courage of the soldiers or the strength of their equipment, but in the shadows of deception. Exercise Tiger, the rehearsal at Slapton Sands in April 1944, was a grim foreshadowing. German E-boats stumbled upon the practice landings and sank several troop ships. Over 700 Americans drowned. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. One recalled, "We were told never to speak of it. But I couldn't stop thinking, if this happened in training, what would the real thing be like?" Meanwhile, British civilians living near embarkation zones felt the war pressing into their homes. Entire villages in Devon and Dorset were evacuated to make room for training. An elderly farmer later remembered, "They came with orders, told us to leave. We packed what we could. For months we heard nothing, just the noise of tanks where our fields had been." The scale was astonishing. Over 2.5 million men eventually gathered in Britain for the assault. One American GI joked, "If you dropped a pin on England, you'd hit a soldier. Chapter 3. Operation Bodyguard, the Master Deception. By the spring of 1944, the Allies faced a paradox. Their invasion force was so massive that it could not be hidden, yet it was so vital that it could not be revealed. The German High Command knew an invasion was coming. What they did not know was where. The job of the Allies was to make sure Hitler guessed wrong. The solution was not one deception plan, but many, woven together into a grand tapestry of lies and illusions. Collectively, they were given the code name Operation Bodyguard. The name came from Winston Churchill himself, who declared, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Bodyguard was not just a single trick. It was a campaign of deception on a continental scale, designed to mislead the enemy in multiple directions at once, until even when the invasion began, Hitler would not believe what his own eyes were telling him. A web of lies. The central idea was simple: overwhelm German intelligence with so many possibilities, so much contradictory evidence, that they could not determine the truth. Bodyguard included Operation Fortitude North, suggesting an invasion of Norway; Operation Fortitude South, suggesting the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais; Operation Zeppelin, creating the threat of an invasion in the Balkans; Operation Glimmer and Taxable, using radar and deception ships to simulate fleets sailing toward Calais; Operation Copperhead, sending a body double of General Montgomery on a tour abroad to convince the Germans he was far from Normandy. All of these worked together like pieces of a puzzle. If the Germans suspected a trick in one place, they would find confirmation in another. Fortitude North, the Phantom Army in Scotland. The first illusion was aimed at Norway. German planners had long feared an attack there, because Norway controlled vital sea routes and iron or shipments from Sweden. So the Allies played into those fears. Fortitude North invented a fictional British Fourth Army, supposedly based in Scotland. Radio operators created fake chatter, transmitting reports of supply shortages, troop movements, and requests for equipment. Phantom units were listed on organizational charts. Even the press was manipulated, with carefully planted rumors of troops training in the Scottish Highlands. To German ears, the evidence was convincing. Hitler became convinced Norway remained a target, and he kept nearly 250,000 German soldiers stationed there, troops who might otherwise have defended France. Fortitude South, the great illusion at Calais. But the most important deception was Fortitude South. Its goal was nothing less than to make Hitler believe that the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest distance across the Channel and the most logical target. To sell this illusion, the Allies created an entire fake army group, the First U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was enormous, consisting of more than a dozen divisions. In reality, it was nothing more than an elaborate stage set. Fields in southeast England sprouted rows of inflatable tanks. Wooden dummies of aircraft dotted airfields. Harbors filled with dummy landing craft, many made of little more than canvas and plywood. At night, headlights and campfires glowed, giving the impression of vast encampments. By day, radio operators transmitted endless streams of bogus messages about fuel deliveries, supply shortages, training schedules, exactly the kind of chatter real units would generate. And presiding over this ghost army was a real general, George S. Patton. Patton, the decoy general. Patton was, in many ways, the perfect choice. To the Germans, he was the Allies' most aggressive and dangerous commander. After his victories in North Africa and Sicily, they believed he would surely lead the invasion of France. So when Patton appeared in southeast England, inspecting his divisions of inflatable tanks and plywood artillery, German spies dutifully reported it. The deception gained immense credibility. To Hitler, it was obvious. Patton and Fusag would strike at Calais. Even after the real landings began in Normandy, German commanders hesitated to move their reserves. They were convinced Normandy was a feint, a diversion meant to draw them away from the real invasion still to come at Calais. Double agents and the web of deceit. But inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft alone could not carry the illusion. The deception depended above all on double agents, spies who fed false information directly into German intelligence. Chief among them was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. A Spanish double agent, Garbo invented an entire network of imaginary subagents across Britain. Through careful, believable reports, he built up such trust with the Germans that they believed his word over almost anyone else's. Garbo assured his handlers that Calais was the true invasion site. He sent reports describing observed troop movements toward Dover, conversations overheard about Calais, and sources confirming the build-up of Patton's Fusag. When D-Day came, Garbo even sent a message claiming the Normandy landings were a diversion. German intelligence believed him. Other double agents played their parts. Brutus, Tricycle, Treasure, Bronx, Tate, each adding threads to the tapestry of lies. By the time the invasion arrived, German intelligence was ensnared in a web so tangled they could not escape it. The Germans believe the illusion. The deception worked better than the Allies dared hope. German reinforcements remained bottled up far from Normandy. Even weeks after the landings, Hitler refused to release armored divisions from Calais. He clung to the belief that the real invasion was still to come. Historians estimate that because of fortitude, as many as 15 German divisions were kept away from Normandy during the critical first weeks. This gave the Allies the breathing room they needed to consolidate their beachhead, expand inland, and eventually liberate France. The art of illusion. Looking back, Operation Bodyguard was as audacious as the landings themselves. It combined psychology, technology, and theater on a scale never seen before. Armies of rubber and canvas, generals who were doubles, radio signals that spoke of battles that would never be fought. It was warfare by illusion, deception as a weapon, and in June 1944, it proved every bit as powerful as the tanks and ships that stormed the beaches. The artistry of deception often bordered on theater. The British Deception Unit, the Royal Engineers Camouflage Section, recruited stage magicians, set designers, and artists to create convincing illusions. As one officer put it, "We were not so much soldiers as conjurers." Patton himself added credibility. The Germans monitored his movements obsessively. When he appeared in Kent, German reports claimed he was certainly preparing the decisive blow. Allied planners knew his reputation was a weapon in itself. Even Churchill could not resist a flourish. Before the landings, he quipped to his generals, "Truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." His words became the guiding motto for the entire deception campaign. 4 ordinary German soldiers manning bunkers at Calais, the build-up seemed undeniable. One recalled after the war, "We were certain they would come to us." Everything pointed to Calais. When word came about Normandy, we thought it was a trick. Chapter 4. The Ghost Armies. On the rolling fields of southern England in the spring of 1944, entire armies began to appear. To anyone flying overhead, they looked formidable. Long lines of Sherman tanks, artillery batteries dug into hedgerows, fleets of landing craft waiting along the shore. Vast camps dotted the countryside, filled with tents, trucks, and men. But most of it was an illusion. The tanks were made of rubber, the aircraft of canvas and plywood. The landing craft were little more than wooden shells stretched over scaffolding. Even the men, at least in some places, were mannequins placed around campfires to give the impression of life. This was the world of the ghost armies, the physical embodiment of Operation Bodyguard's grand deception. Building an army out of air. The idea was simple but brilliant. If the Germans were watching, give them something to see. Enemy reconnaissance planes were still flying over Britain, their cameras snapping images of the invasion build-up. Instead of trying to hide the real armies, Allied planners decided to bury them in a forest of fakes. Special units of engineers, stage designers, and artists were tasked with creating convincing replicas of military equipment. Inflatable tanks were crafted with astonishing detail, so realistic that from a few hundred feet in the air, it was nearly impossible to tell they weren't real. Lightweight wooden aircraft, painted and propped at precise angles, gave the impression of crowded airfields. Dummy landing craft were tethered in rivers and estuaries, bobbing gently in the tide. Even the small details were considered. Laundry lines were strung between tents. Trucks drove in circles to kick up dust, simulating heavy traffic. At night, lanterns and campfires were lit in patterns that suggested thousands of soldiers living and training. The sound of war that wasn't there. Visual deception was powerful, but the Allies went further. They created the sound of an army. Giant loudspeakers, some powerful enough to carry several miles, broadcast the noise of tanks moving, engines idling, and men drilling. These soundscapes were carefully recorded and looped, creating the impression of massive units maneuvering just out of sight. German intelligence analysts who intercepted the sounds or saw the staged activity from the air added them to their growing body of evidence that huge invasion forces were massing across from Calais. The fake ports of England. One of the most ambitious illusions was the construction of dummy embarkation ports. Along stretches of the British coast, particularly in Kent and Sussex, scaffolding and plywood were used to create fake docks and piers. Dummy ships floated offshore, while fake fuel tanks and supply depots lined the beaches. From the air, the deception was convincing. German pilots reported bustling harbors filled with invasion craft. The truth was that the real invasion fleet was gathering far to the west, in ports like Portsmouth and Devon, destined not for Calais but for Normandy. Fortitude in action, feeding Hitler's obsession. The ghost armies were not built in isolation. They worked hand in hand with a stream of false reports sent by double agents like Garbo. When Garbo told his German handlers that divisions were gathering in Kent, German reconnaissance flights were directed to the area, and sure enough, they saw exactly what they expected: rows of tanks, camps, ships. The genius of the deception was not just its creativity, but its consistency. Every piece of the illusion supported the others. What spies reported, what photos showed, what radio signals suggested, all of it painted the same picture: a massive invasion force preparing to strike at Calais under the command of General George Patton. The mannequin paratroopers. Deception even extended to the battlefield itself. On the night before D-Day, as airborne divisions dropped into Normandy, special units released hundreds of dummy paratroopers, nicknamed Rupert dolls, over different parts of France. These mannequins, stuffed with straw and rigged with firecrackers or small explosive charges, simulated the noise of gunfire as they hit the ground. To German defenders, it appeared that airborne landings were happening in multiple locations. Confused and panicked, they spread their forces thin, chasing shadows while real paratroopers secured vital bridges and roads. Hitler's delusion strengthens. For Hitler, the ghost armies confirmed what he already believed. His fixation on Calais was so strong that any evidence pointing elsewhere was dismissed as a ruse. Even after German troops fought real Allied soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, Hitler remained convinced that the landings were only a diversion. He held back his armored reserves, waiting for Patton's ghost army to appear at Calais. In truth, Patton's divisions never existed. The soldiers, tanks, and ships that Hitler feared were mostly rubber, wood, and clever radio chatter. The power of stagecraft. The ghost armies blurred the line between war and theater. Soldiers became stagehands. Engineers became set designers. Radio operators became scriptwriters, filling the airwaves with dialogue for an army that did not exist. It was not glamorous work. Inflating rubber tanks in the rain, painting plywood aircraft, or stringing laundry lines in muddy fields did not carry the same romance as charging a beachhead. Yet without these efforts, the real armies might never have reached those beaches alive. The deception was so successful that long after D-Day, German commanders continued to hesitate. 4 weeks, panzer divisions stayed near Calais, waiting for Patton's army to strike. By the time they realized no such army existed, the Allies were already driving inland, breaking out of Normandy, and racing across France. A victory of imagination. The story of the ghost armies is a reminder that war is fought not only with steel and blood, but with imagination. Inflatable tanks and plywood planes may sound laughable, but in 1944 they were weapons as potent as any rifle. They bought the Allies precious time. They split German attention. They gave flesh and blood soldiers a fighting chance to win on the beaches of Normandy. In the end, deception succeeded because it told the Germans exactly what they wanted to believe. And in that sense, the ghost armies were not just illusions. They were mirrors, reflecting Hitler's own fears back at him until he could no longer see the truth. The men who built the ghost armies often joked that they were more stagehands than soldiers. One U.S. engineer recalled, "We spent the war inflating rubber tanks. People laughed, but those balloons saved lives." British deception officer Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician in civilian life, claimed he could make entire armies disappear. While his tales were often exaggerated, many magicians and artists did serve in camouflage units, turning the battlefield into a stage. For locals in Kent and Sussex, the illusion was strangely real. Farmers saw armies appear overnight in their fields, only to discover they were canvas shells and rubber shapes. One villager remembered, "We knew it wasn't real, but it looked so convincing, we wondered if even the Germans would be fooled." When German pilots flew reconnaissance over the area, they dutifully photographed what they believed were massive build-ups. The deception was working so well that Allied planners sometimes worried. Would the Germans see through it if it was too perfect? Chapter 5. The Spies Who Never Were. If the ghost armies were the stage sets of deception, then the double agents were the actors, though most of them never set foot on the battlefield. Instead, they played their roles in safe houses, backrooms, and behind typewriters. Their weapons were forged documents, carefully worded reports, and the art of earning trust from enemies who would never see their faces. The Allies called it the double-cross system. The idea was deceptively simple: capture German spies sent into Britain, then turn them into double agents, feeding the Germans just enough genuine intelligence to keep them credible, while ensuring that their most important reports were fabrications. By 1944, the system was so effective that virtually every German spy in Britain was under Allied control. The Germans didn't know it, but their own intelligence network had been hijacked, and through it, the Allies could drip-feed whatever story they wished, especially the illusion of an invasion at Calais. Garbo, the greatest liar in history. At the center of the deception stood Juan Pujol Garcia, a failed Spanish businessman who reinvented himself as one of the most extraordinary double agents of the war. His code name, Garbo, because he played his role as convincingly as any Hollywood actor. Garbo had approached both the British and the Germans at different times, offering his services as a spy. Initially dismissed, he persisted until MI5 realized his potential. With a flair for invention, Garbo created an entire network of imaginary subagents. He claimed to have dozens of contacts: dockworkers in Liverpool, soldiers in barracks, even secretaries in government offices. In truth, these agents existed only on paper. But Garbo spun their stories with such skill that German intelligence believed him completely. Reports flowed to Berlin describing troop movements, supply shortages, and morale. Sometimes the information was accurate but trivial, such as weather conditions or the arrival of convoys, making him appear trustworthy. But when it mattered most, Garbo lied. By 1944, the Germans considered him one of their most valuable assets in Britain. They trusted him so deeply that they decorated him with the Iron Cross, an award normally reserved for frontline bravery. It was Garbo who assured Berlin that Patton's Phantom Army in southeast England was real. It was Garbo who insisted, on the very day of the Normandy landings, that the attack was merely a diversion. His credibility was so great that even as German troops fought and died in Normandy, their leaders held back, waiting for the real invasion that never came. The cast of shadows. Garbo was not alone. A whole gallery of double agents helped weave the tapestry of deception. Brutus, Roman Czerniawski, a Polish officer who had once spied for the Germans, captured by the Allies and turned. Brutus provided reports on Allied air forces and, crucially, reinforced the Calais narrative. Tricycle, Dusan Popov, a Serbian playboy and gambler. Tricycle was charming, reckless, and flamboyant. He fed the Germans believable tidbits while slipping them poison pills of misinformation. Treasure, Lily Sergeev, a Russian émigré with complicated loyalties. Treasure became a vital channel for false intelligence. Tate, Wolf Schmidt, originally sent by the Germans as a spy. Tate was captured and turned, providing a steady drip of reports that built credibility for the bigger lies. Each agent had their own style, their own voice. Some cultivated relationships with handlers through carefully crafted letters. Others transmitted reports by coded radio. Collectively, they created a choir of deception, each voice harmonizing with the others to convince the Germans that Calais was the true target. Feeding the beast. The genius of the double-cross system lay in balance. Too many lies would have exposed the agents. So the British carefully mixed truth with fiction. Reports might include real convoy schedules, weather conditions, or minor troop movements, none of which would compromise the invasion. Then, amid these truths, the lies were planted. When Garbo's agents claimed to see divisions massing in Kent, German aerial reconnaissance confirmed it. Dummy tanks and inflatable aircraft exactly where Garbo said they would be. When Brutus hinted that Allied bombers were targeting Calais supply lines, German analysts saw their suspicions reinforced. It was a carefully orchestrated echo chamber. What spies said, what reconnaissance showed, and what the Germans already believed, all lined up. The illusion became reality. The message on D-Day. On June 6, 1944, as Allied troops waded ashore in Normandy, Garbo sent a critical message to his German handlers. He reported that the landings were genuine, but insisted they were only a feint, a preliminary strike to draw German forces away from the real invasion still to come at Calais. Berlin believed him. So convinced were they of Garbo's reliability that they passed his message directly to the German High Command. Even Hitler himself accepted it. Orders went out. Hold the panzer divisions in reserve. Do not commit them to Normandy. Wait for the true blow. Those hours of hesitation were decisive. By the time Hitler finally realized Normandy was the main front, the Allies had already secured a foothold. The deception had bought them the most precious resource of all, time. When lies save lives. It is impossible to calculate exactly how many lives were saved by the double-cross system, but historians agree that the success of D-Day depended as much on deception as on courage. Had German armored divisions rolled toward Normandy in the critical first days, the landings might have failed. Instead, they waited for Patton's Phantom Army. They waited for divisions that never arrived. They waited for spies who never existed. The war after the war. After D-Day, many double agents faded back into obscurity. Some lived quietly, never revealing their roles until decades later. Juan Pujol Garcia, Garbo himself, eventually retired to Venezuela, where he ran a small business. 4 years, few believed his story. Only later did historians confirm that his lies had been among the most decisive of the war. The legacy of the double-cross system endures as one of the greatest achievements of Allied intelligence. It demonstrated that wars are not won by weapons alone. They are also won by deception, manipulation, and the ability to make the enemy see ghosts. The hidden army of shadows. While soldiers prepared to storm beaches and paratroopers risked their lives behind enemy lines, a quieter army fought in the shadows, men and women whose battleground was the mind. They fought with whispers, with letters, with falsehoods so carefully woven they became indistinguishable from truth. They fought not for medals or glory, but for the chance to give others a better chance at survival. And on June 6, 1944, their victory was measured not in territory captured, but in tanks that never arrived, divisions that never moved, and decisions delayed until it was too late. The spies who never had done their job. Garbo's success was not without risk. At one point, the Germans even complained that his reports were too detailed, fearing he might be discovered by the British. Ironically, this complaint only strengthened their trust. Why would the British allow such a brilliant spy to continue sending reports unless he was genuine? The double agents were not glamorous figures. Brutus, Tricycle, Treasure, and others lived under constant pressure, aware that a slip could cost not only their lives but the entire invasion. One agent later confessed, "I dreamed in code. I woke up with cipher tables in my head. It was a madness, but it had to be done." Historians later estimated that Garbo's imaginary network of subagents produced over 300 reports in the months leading up to D-Day. Each report added a new brushstroke to the picture of Calais as the target. A German officer after the war admitted, "We were misled by an army of shadows. We believed in divisions that did not exist, and in spies who were never there." Chapter 6. Breaking German Codes. War is often remembered in explosions, battles, and blood. Yet some of its most decisive victories are silent, won not by guns but by pencils, typewriters, and machines that looked like little more than cabinets of wires and wheels. In the story of D-Day, the secret war of intelligence was as crucial as the armies and fleets. Without the code-breakers of Bletchley Park and the power of ultra-intelligence, the Great Deception might never have succeeded. The German Enigma. The heart of German military communication was the Enigma machine, a cipher device that scrambled messages into seemingly unbreakable codes. Every day, the Germans changed their encryption settings, ensuring that each new morning began with a fresh puzzle. To those who intercepted Enigma traffic, the messages looked like nonsense, long strings of random letters. But nonsense can hide meaning, and at Bletchley Park, an unassuming mansion north of London, some of the greatest minds of the Allied war effort laboured to unlock that meaning. Bletchley Park, the hidden army. Bletchley Park was not a battlefield, yet it was filled with soldiers of another kind, mathematicians, linguists, crossword experts, and chess champions gathered in its huts and offices. Among them was the brilliant but eccentric Alan Turing, whose work on early computing machines helped automate the breaking of Enigma. Day and night, teams worked in secrecy, feeding intercepted German transmissions into machines called bombs, mechanical devices that churned through possible settings of the Enigma rotors until the right combination was found. Once cracked, the encrypted gibberish revealed orders, reports, and conversations between German commanders. To maintain secrecy, only a small circle of Allied leaders knew the full extent of what ultra-intelligence provided. Even frontline commanders were often told only that their information came from a special source. Confirming the deception. For the planners of D-Day, Ultra was priceless. The deception operations, Fortitude, Bodyguard, the Ghost Armies, were only as good as the enemy's belief in them. How could the Allies know whether the Germans were truly convinced? The answer lay in the intercepts. When Garbo or Brutus sent a false report, codebreakers at Bletchley could often see the German response days later. Messages between Berlin and field commanders revealed whether the lies had taken hold. Again and again, the evidence came back clear. The Germans were buying it. Reports spoke of divisions being moved to Calais, reinforcements held back, defensive preparations in Norway. Hitler himself was recorded reiterating his conviction that Normandy was only a feint. For the deceivers, these confirmations were like oxygen. Each new intercept was proof that their illusions were working, that their phantom armies were real in the minds of their enemies. The weather factor. Ultra also gave insight into another critical factor: weather. German meteorologists had limited access to Atlantic data, while the Allies, with bases in Iceland and ships across the ocean, had a clearer picture. This advantage allowed the Allies to choose the invasion window with greater confidence. When D-Day was postponed from June 5 to June 6 due to storms, the Germans were caught off guard. Intercepts showed they believed bad weather made invasion impossible. Many commanders left their posts to attend war games. Some units relaxed their guard. When the invasion came, it struck a coastline that was less prepared than usual. The silence of secrecy. The work at Bletchley Park remained one of the greatest secrets of the war. The men and women who laboured there could never speak of their achievements. They lived in huts with blackout curtains, worked endless shifts, and endured the monotony of decoding message after message. But they knew that every word mattered. A single intercepted order could reveal the position of a panzer division. A decrypted report might confirm that Hitler still expected an invasion at Calais. In the quiet clatter of typewriters and machines, the fate of D-Day was being decided. Impact on D-Day. By June 1944, ultra-intelligence had become a vital compass for Allied decision-makers. It not only confirmed that deception was working, but also provided warnings of German troop movements. Commanders could see when reinforcements were being delayed, when defensive preparations were faltering, and when the enemy's attention was elsewhere. It is no exaggeration to say that without Bletchley Park, the Allies would have been fighting blind. With it, they fought with foresight, anticipating German moves, exploiting their errors, and reinforcing the illusion that Calais remained the true invasion site. War of Minds. In the end, the Battle of Codes was as much about psychology as mathematics. The Germans believed their enigma was unbreakable. Their overconfidence blinded them to the possibility that their messages were being read. And so, even as deception agents like Garbo spun their tales, Ultra provided the proof that those tales had become reality. The war of machines, men, and ideas converged here. In Normandy, soldiers would bleed. In Bletchley, minds would bend. Both were necessary for victory. Legacy of secrecy. The story of Bletchley Park and Ultra remained hidden for decades after the war. Only in the 1970s did the full scale of the code-breaking effort become known to the public. By then, many of those who had worked in secrecy had lived quiet lives, never speaking of their contributions. Yet historians now agree. The work of Bletchley shortened the war by years, and in the case of D-Day, ensured that the deception operations succeeded beyond expectation. It was not just the guns on the beaches, nor the bravery of paratroopers in the night. It was also the quiet scratch of pencils, the clatter of machines, and the whispers of intercepted German voices that helped secure the beginning of liberation. The work at Bletchley Park was grueling. One codebreaker wrote in her diary, "We sat in silence, hour after hour, the machines clicking like insects. We lived on tea and cigarettes. The weight of the war pressed on us, though no one outside knew what we did." The secrecy was so strict that many who worked there never told their families. Some went to their graves without ever revealing their role in cracking Enigma. One veteran said, "My parents thought I spent the war filing papers. They never knew I helped invade France." Ultra was so sensitive that commanders sometimes ignored it rather than risk exposing the source. Even so, by confirming that Hitler still believed in Calais, Ultra gave the deception campaign priceless validation. In hindsight, Bletchley's contribution may have saved months of fighting. Churchill himself once said, "It was thanks to Ultra that we won the war." While that was an exaggeration, there is no doubt that without Ultra, the deception of D-Day could not have been trusted. Chapter 7. Weather, Chance, and Fate. Wars are often decided by armies and weapons, but sometimes the greatest general is the weather. For D-Day, the skies and seas of the English Channel played as crucial a role as any soldier, tank, or deception plan. The unpredictable Channel. The English Channel is narrow, but treacherous. Its tides are powerful, its weather fickle. In June, storms can sweep in suddenly, churning the sea into chaos. For an invasion fleet of thousands of ships, timing was everything. The Allied planners had chosen early June 1944 because the tides, moonlight, and hours of daylight offered the best combination for landing operations. The tides would expose German beach obstacles at the right moment. The moon would give paratroopers light to navigate by. The long summer days would extend the operational window. But within those days, the invasion required almost perfect conditions. If the seas were too rough, landing craft would founder. If the skies were too cloudy, bombers and fighters could not provide cover. If the winds were too strong, paratroopers would scatter hopelessly. The margin for error was razor-thin. The weatherman in command. Into this uncertainty stepped Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist for the Allied Expeditionary Force. Stagg was a quiet, serious man, trained in the science of weather but fully aware of its human consequences. On his forecasts rested the fate of the greatest invasion in history. Stagg and his team analyzed data from ships, aircraft, and weather stations across the Atlantic. Unlike the Germans, the Allies had access to information from stations in Greenland, Iceland, and North America, giving them a clearer picture of incoming systems. At first, forecasts looked grim. A powerful storm threatened to lash the Channel in the first week of June. Winds and waves would make a landing impossible. On June 4th, just one day before the scheduled invasion, Stagg reported that conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Eisenhower listened, grim-faced, as his meteorologist told him the truth. If they launched on June 5th, the invasion fleet would be scattered, the landings a disaster. The tense postponement. The decision was agonizing. Hundreds of thousands of men were already aboard ships, ready to sail. Troops had been briefed. Equipment was loaded. To delay now risked confusion, fatigue, and exposure of the invasion's secret. But to go forward in a storm would be suicide. Eisenhower ordered a postponement. The invasion would not sail on June 5th. The room was heavy with tension. Could the operation even be delayed? The next possible window, with the right tides and moonlight, would not come until late June. Would the entire plan have to be scrapped and restarted weeks later? Would secrecy hold that long? A window in the storm. Then, on June 5th, Stagg returned with unexpected news. A brief break in the weather was coming, a 24-hour window of calmer seas and clearer skies on June 6th. It would not be perfect, but it would be good enough. The gamble was enormous. The difference between success and catastrophe might hinge on Stagg's prediction. Eisenhower gathered his commanders late that evening. Around the table, voices debated, some urging caution, others willing to take the risk. Finally, Eisenhower made the call. The invasion would go ahead on June 6th. His words were simple. "Okay, let's go." Hitler's miscalculation. On the other side of the Channel, German meteorologists lacked the same data. From their limited perspective, the storm looked set to continue. They predicted the seas would remain rough, the skies clouded. An invasion seemed impossible. Confident in this forecast, many German commanders relaxed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of defending the French coast, even returned to Germany to visit his wife and present her with a pair of shoes for her birthday. Other officers left their posts to attend a war game. When the Allied fleet began moving, it caught the Germans by surprise. Their confidence in the weather had betrayed them. The role of chance. The story of D-Day whether unders how chance and fate can tip the scales of history. Had the storm lasted longer, the invasion might have been delayed for weeks, risking exposure of Allied plans. Had Stagg misjudged his forecast, the landings could have ended in disaster. Instead, a narrow window of opportunity aligned with Eisenhower's courage to seize it. The greatest invasion in history sailed into that gap, catching the enemy unprepared. The human side of waiting. For the soldiers crammed aboard landing ships, the delay was excruciating. Seasickness plagued them as the vessels rocked in the Channel. Anxiety gnawed as rumors spread of postponement. Some feared the invasion would never come, others dreaded that it would. When the order finally arrived, "We go on June 6th," a strange calm settled over many. At least the waiting was over. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it soon. A coin toss of history. Looking back, historians often note how much depended on that single forecast. The difference of one day, storm versus calm, delay versus go, might have altered the course of the war. D-Day was not only a triumph of arms and deception, but also a triumph of meteorology, a testament to the fragile interplay between planning and chance. It was a reminder that even the mightiest armies march at the mercy of the skies. Group Captain James Stagg later recalled the tension in the room as he gave his forecast to Eisenhower. "You could feel the weight of history pressing on us. Every eye was on me, waiting for me to tell them whether the greatest invasion ever planned would sail or not." One staff officer wrote home afterward, "It came down to the clouds. Imagine all the armies, all the tanks, all the ships, waiting on a man pointing at a weather map." On the German side, overconfidence was fatal. A Luftwaffe meteorologist later admitted, "We had no data from the Western Atlantic. We assumed the storm would last for days. We were wrong, and that mistake doomed us." Rommel's absence on June 6 became infamous. Visiting his wife in Germany, he hoped to discuss her birthday. "When I returned," he said after the war, "the invasion had already begun. I had miscalculated the weather, and with it, the fate of France." Group Captain James Stagg later recalled the tension in the room as he gave his forecast to Eisenhower. "You could feel the weight of history pressing on us. Every eye was on me, waiting for me to tell them whether the greatest invasion ever planned would sail or not." One staff officer wrote home afterward, "It came down to the clouds. Imagine all the armies, all the tanks, all the ships, waiting on a man pointing at a weather map." On the German side, overconfidence was fatal. A Luftwaffe meteorologist later admitted, "We had no data from the Western Atlantic. We assumed the storm would last for days. We were wrong, and that mistake doomed us." Rommel's absence on June 6 became infamous. Visiting his wife in Germany, he hoped to discuss her birthday. "When I returned," he said after the war, "the invasion had already begun. I had miscalculated the weather, and with it, the fate of France." Chapter 8. The Final Countdown. The evening of June 5, 1944, was unlike any other in history. Across southern England, the air vibrated with the sound of engines. In ports and harbors, ships tugged at their moorings. Along darkened airfields, rows of transport planes waited with doors open, engines warming. Soldiers, paratroopers, commandos, infantrymen checked their weapons, tightened their straps, and waited for the order. For months they had trained, speculated, and wondered when the day would come. Now it was here. The airborne gamble. Before the first landing craft touched the beaches, thousands of men would already be on French soil. Their mission was among the most dangerous of the entire operation: parachute and glider landings deep behind enemy lines. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were tasked with securing key causeways and road junctions behind Utah Beach. Without them, landing troops might be trapped on the sand, unable to move inland. To the east, the British 6th Airborne Division was assigned to capture bridges across the River Orne and silence German artillery that threatened Sword Beach. The night sky over England filled with the drone of hundreds of C-47 transport planes. Inside, paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder, faces blackened with camouflage paint. Some were calm, others restless. Many carried small personal tokens, a photo of a loved one, a letter, a lucky charm. As the green light blinked on, they leapt into the darkness, parachutes snapping open above them. Across Normandy, fields lit up with a flicker of tracer fire as German guns sought the descending shadows. Many paratroopers landed far from their intended drop zones, scattered in hedgerows, swamps, and villages. Yet confusion, paradoxically, worked in their favor. German defenders could not tell where the main force was, or how many had arrived. The glider men. Alongside the paratroopers came the silent wings of gliders. These fragile craft, made of wood and canvas, carried troops, jeeps, and even small artillery pieces. Towed into the night by bombers, they were cut loose to glide toward landing zones. The risks were immense. Gliders had no engines, no second chances. Many crashed into fields, trees, or ditches, breaking apart on impact. Yet their crews fought their way out and pressed on. In one of the most daring actions, British glider troops landed almost directly beside the Pegasus Bridge, storming the German defenders in a lightning assault. By dawn, the bridge was in Allied hands, one of the first victories of D-Day. The French resistance. On the ground, the French resistance was already at work. In the weeks before D-Day, coded messages broadcast by the BBC had signaled them to prepare. On the night of June 5th, final instructions crackled over the airwaves. Saboteurs cut telephone lines, derailed trains, and blew up bridges. These actions sowed chaos in German communications, delaying reinforcements and forcing commanders to rely on slower, less reliable methods of control. Farmers and villagers risked their lives to guide paratroopers, hide stragglers, and provide intelligence on German positions. The invasion was not only an Allied operation, it was also a French uprising, hidden in shadows, that helped tip the balance. Eisenhower's longest night. Back in England, in the Allied Command Center, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the longest night of his life. The decision had been made. The invasion was underway. Now, it was out of his hands. He walked among the paratroopers before they boarded, speaking quietly to them, offering words of encouragement. Many would not return, and Eisenhower knew it. Later, he stood on the airfield and watched the planes vanish into the night, their lights dwindling in the distance. "They're on their way," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. In his pocket, he still carried the note he had drafted earlier, the statement he would issue if the invasion failed. It was a burden few men have ever carried, the knowledge that the lives of hundreds of thousands depended on choices already made. The fleet sets sail. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the greatest armada in history was on the move. More than 7,000 ships of every size slipped out of ports, escorted by destroyers and corvettes. Minesweepers cleared paths through the waters, while battleships and cruisers took up firing positions. For the men aboard the landing craft, the journey was misery. Packed tightly, buffeted by waves, many grew violently seasick. The stench of vomit mixed with oil and salt water. Soldiers sat in silence, clutching their rifles, staring into the dark. Some prayed. Others joked nervously. A few wrote last letters, knowing they might never be sent. Deception to the last. Even as the invasion fleet crossed the Channel, the deception plan continued. Operations Glimmer and Taxable sent small groups of ships toward Calais, towing radar-reflecting balloons and broadcasting fake radio chatter. To German radar operators, it looked like invasion fleets approaching the real target. The ruse worked. German coastal defenses split their attention. Even on the very night of the invasion, the bodyguard of lies still held. Waiting for dawn. By the early hours of June 6th, the stage was set. Paratroopers fought scattered battles in the hedgerows. Resistance fighters harried German communications. Naval guns trained on the beaches. Landing craft surged forward through the waves. For the men inside, dawn would bring the unknown. Some tried to sleep, heads resting on rifles. Others sat wide-eyed, listening to the steady churn of engines. Officers whispered last instructions. Chaplains offered hurried blessings. The night had been long. The waiting was almost unbearable. But now, as the first hint of light touched the horizon, the invasion of Normandy was about to begin. For the paratroopers, the hours before the jump were unforgettable. Sergeant Wallace Strobel of the 101st Airborne later described it. The green light went on, and suddenly you were out the door, into the night sky. The wind slapped at you, tracers shot past, and all you could think was, "Don't land in a tree, don't land in water." One British glider pilot recalled the terror of descending silently toward Pegasus Bridge. You could see the moonlight glinting on the river. The Germans had no idea we were coming. We landed with a crash that splintered the fuselage, but we were alive, and the bridge was there, just as on the maps. In Normandy villages, French civilians heard the rumble of planes overhead and the thud of parachutes hitting fields. An elderly woman remembered. At first we thought it was bombs. Then I saw men in the hedges. Americans. They gave us chocolate, and we gave them wine. That night, we knew the war was changing. Meanwhile, the men aboard landing craft endured misery. One GI wrote later, "The smell of vomit and diesel fuel was so thick you could hardly breathe. Some prayed. Some smoked. Some just stared at the floor. No one spoke of fear, but it was everywhere." Chapter 9. June 6, 1944. The Day of Days. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke grey and uncertain over the English Channel. To the men huddled in landing craft, the horizon revealed only mist, the low shapes of warships, and the endless churn of waves. But ahead lay the most formidable shoreline in Europe, the beaches of Normandy. This was Operation Neptune, the opening strike of Operation Overlord. More than 156,000 men would land in the first 24 hours. 5 beaches stretched across 50 miles of coast: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each had its own challenges, its own story, its own blood. The Naval Barrage. At 5:30, the silence shattered. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire, unleashing thousands of shells on German defenses. The roar shook the sea. Shorelines erupted in flame and smoke. To soldiers waiting offshore, it seemed as if nothing could survive such bombardment. But many German bunkers had been built of reinforced concrete, dug deep into cliffs and dunes. When the shelling ceased, defenders emerged from the smoke, shaken but alive, weapons ready. Utah Beach. The lucky landing. On the westernmost beach, Utah, the American 4th Infantry Division landed under favorable circumstances. Strong currents carried their landing craft about a mile south of their intended position. Fortune favored them. The defenses there were lighter. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., landing with the first wave despite arthritis and a cane, assessed the situation calmly. "We'll start the war from here," he declared, and directed his men inland. By the end of the day, Utah Beach was secure, with relatively low casualties compared to the other beaches. Omaha Beach. Bloody Omaha. Further east, at Omaha Beach, the story was far more brutal. Here, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced steep bluffs bristling with German guns. The pre-landing bombardment had failed to destroy the defenses. As the landing craft dropped their ramps, machine gun fire ripped into the men inside. Water turned red. Soldiers struggled through waves under heavy fire, many cut down before they reached the sand. Others drowned, weighed down by equipment. Tanks meant to provide cover sank in the surf or were destroyed. Chaos reigned. 4 hours, it seemed Omaha might be lost. Officers were killed, units scattered. Yet small groups of men, sergeants, privates, lieutenants, took initiative. Crawling up bluffs, using grenades and rifles, they silenced bunkers one by one. By evening, against staggering odds, Omaha was in Allied hands. The cost was nearly 3,000 American casualties. Gold Beach. The British push. At Gold Beach, British forces stormed ashore. They faced heavy resistance in fortified towns and villages, but specialized engineering vehicles, Hobart's funnies helped breach obstacles. Flail tanks cleared mines, bridge-laying tanks spanned ditches, and armored bulldozers flattened defenses. By nightfall, British troops had pushed inland and linked with Canadian forces advancing from Juno. Their progress opened the way toward the city of Bayeux, the first major French town to be liberated. Juno Beach. The Canadians fight. The Canadians at Juno Beach faced deadly fire as their landing craft approached. Many of the first waves suffered heavy losses. But once ashore, Canadian troops pressed forward with ferocity. By day's end, they had penetrated deeper inland than any other Allied force, linking with British units and securing a vital foothold. Sword Beach. The eastern flank. On the far eastern flank, Sword Beach, British forces landed with support from French commandos. Their objective was to secure Caen, a city critical for controlling Normandy. Resistance was fierce, and though they gained the beachhead, progress toward Caen proved slower than hoped. Still, Sword connected with airborne units holding bridges across the Orne River, securing the flank from counterattack. The German response. In German headquarters, confusion reigned. Reports of landings poured in from Normandy, but commanders hesitated. Was this the main invasion, or a diversion? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was away in Germany. Hitler was still asleep, and his staff hesitated to wake him. Crucially, armored divisions, the most powerful units in France, could not move without Hitler's direct approval. Hours passed as messages crawled through the chain of command. By the time Hitler authorized movement, it was too late. The Allies were ashore in force. The deception had worked. German commanders clung to the belief that the real invasion would come at Calais. Even as Allied troops fought on the beaches, panzer divisions remained in reserve, waiting for an attack that never came. The human cost. By the evening of June 6th, the Allies had secured all 5 beaches, though at terrible cost. Nearly 10,000 Allied casualties were recorded on the first day, killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were also heavy, though less precisely known. Civilians, too, suffered in the crossfire, their villages shattered by bombardment. For the men who survived, the memories of D-Day would never fade. The roar of guns, the screams of the wounded, the smell of smoke and salt and blood. The turning point. Yet despite the carnage, the invasion had succeeded. A foothold had been gained. From those 5 beaches, the liberation of Western Europe had begun. D-Day did not win the war in a single day, but it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's empire had been pierced at last. And behind the courage of the men who stormed ashore lay the invisible victories of deception, intelligence, and weather, a convergence of factors that made June 6, 1944, not only the longest day, but also the day that changed the course of history. At Omaha Beach, Private Charles Shea, a Native American medic, remembered dragging wounded men from the surf. "I saw so many lying in the water, and I thought, if I don't help them, no one will. I pulled them out one by one." The sea was red. A German machine gunner at Omaha described it differently. "We fired until the barrels of our guns glowed. We thought no one could survive. But still they came, crawling inch by inch, and we knew, if they reached us, we were finished." At Utah, General Roosevelt Jr.'s calm decision to land from here became legendary. A soldier later recalled, "He stood there with his cane, cool as could be. It made us feel like maybe we could do this after all." On Juno Beach, Canadian Captain Paul Triquet urged his men forward under fire. "There is only one safe place, and that is on the objective." His courage helped push Canadian forces farther inland than any other army that day. For French civilians, liberation came with fear. A woman in Cannes later said, "We wanted freedom, but it came with fire. Houses burned, people died, and we didn't know if the Allies would succeed. But when we saw them, tired and dirty, giving us chewing gum and cigarettes, we knew France was coming back." Chapter 10. The Aftermath of Deception. When the sun set on June 6, 1944, the Allies had done the impossible. They had crossed the English Channel, stormed the beaches of Normandy, and established a foothold on continental Europe. Yet the battle was far from over. What followed in the days and weeks after D-Day was as much a triumph of deception as it was of arms. Hitler's obsession with Calais. For years, Hitler had believed that the Pas de Calais was the true invasion target. Even after Allied troops were fighting and dying in Normandy, he refused to let go of that conviction. Reports from double agents like Garbeau reinforced his belief. Reconnaissance seemed to confirm that Patton's first U.S. Army group was still massing in southeast England, ready to strike across the narrowest point of the Channel. To Hitler, Normandy looked like a distraction, a lure to draw German forces away from the real invasion. This obsession had catastrophic consequences. Even as panzer divisions waited in reserve, they were not committed to Normandy. Days turned into weeks. Troops that might have crushed the beachhead remained idle, guarding against a phantom threat at Calais. Reinforcements that never came. The result was a critical imbalance. The Germans had enough strength in France to launch a devastating counterattack, but only if they concentrated it. Instead, they spread their forces thin, holding back key divisions in the north. At one point, ultra-intercepts revealed that 15 German divisions remained tied down near Calais, unwilling to move south. The deception had achieved its ultimate goal, keeping the enemy divided at the moment when unity could have changed everything. A fortress of lies. To German intelligence officers, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Garbeau's reports spoke of continued build-ups in Kent. Dummy landing craft and inflatable tanks remained in place, visible to reconnaissance. Radio chatter from the Phantom Fusag divisions continued, scripted carefully by Allied operators. The illusion lived on. Even in July, more than a month after D-Day, Hitler told his generals that Normandy was only a diversion. The main invasion, he insisted, was still to come at Calais. By the time he realized the truth, it was far too late. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Cherbourg, and were driving toward Paris. Buying time with illusions. The impact of the deception cannot be overstated. Every day that German divisions sat idle in Calais was another day for the Allies to land reinforcements, build up supplies, and expand their beachhead. By late June, hundreds of thousands of troops had crossed into France. Mulberry harbors funneled equipment ashore. The Pluto pipelines pumped fuel across the Channel. The bridgehead was no longer fragile. It was growing stronger by the hour. And it was deception that bought that precious time. Hitler's distrust of his generals. The deception succeeded not only because of Allied cunning, but also because of German dysfunction. Hitler's paranoia and micromanagement crippled his response. Many of his generals argued that Normandy was the true invasion, that reinforcements must be sent immediately. But Hitler distrusted them. He trusted instead the evidence that confirmed his own beliefs, evidence carefully planted by Allied deception. This distrust sowed hesitation. Orders were delayed, counterattacks postponed. When panzer divisions finally moved toward Normandy in force, they were met not by a fragile beachhead, but by a fortified front bristling with Allied firepower. The Battle of Normandy. The weeks after D-Day were brutal. Fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy was slow, bloody, and costly. German troops defended every village, every field. Tanks lurked behind hedges. Machine guns covered narrow lanes. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Yet the Allies had one decisive advantage. They were not facing the full strength of the German army. With so many divisions pinned near Calais, Normandy became a war of attrition the Germans could not win. By late July, the Allies broke out of the bocage with Operation Cobra, unleashing a flood of armor that raced across France. Within weeks, Paris was liberated. The road to Germany lay open. Deception shortens the war. Historians estimate that the success of Operation Bodyguard and its sub-plans shortened the war by months, perhaps longer. Without it, D-Day might have failed outright, or succeeded only at catastrophic cost. Instead, the deception ensured that the Germans were always a step behind, reacting to phantoms, waiting for blows that never came. By the time they realized where the real battle was, the Allies had already won it. The quiet heroes of lies. In the aftermath, the role of deception remained largely hidden. The soldiers who stormed the beaches became the public heroes, as they deserved. The spies, double agents, code breakers, and deception planners worked in silence, their contributions veiled by secrecy. But those who knew understood the truth. The illusions of Bodyguard had been as decisive as the guns of Neptune. The greatest invasion in history had not only been a triumph of courage, but also a triumph of imagination. In Berlin, Hitler raged at his generals. Even weeks after D-Day, he insisted the Normandy landings were a diversion. One staff officer later recalled, "He shouted that the main invasion was still to come at Calais." None dared to contradict him, though many of us knew the truth by then. German soldiers stationed near Calais described the surreal experience of waiting for an enemy who never arrived. One wrote in his diary, "We were fully armed, our tanks fueled, waiting for the English to come. Each morning we looked to the sea, but the horizon remained empty." Meanwhile, Allied troops slogging through the hedgerows of Normandy were grateful for every German unit pinned at Calais. A British sergeant later reflected, "If those panzer divisions had hit us in June, we'd have been thrown back into the Channel. It was the lies that saved us." Historians agree. The historian Sir Michael Howard wrote, "No single deception in military history has had such a profound effect as fortitude. The divisions immobilized at Calais made all the difference between success and failure in Normandy." Chapter 11. Epilogue. Lessons of D-Day. On the beaches of Normandy today, the tide washes quietly over sand once soaked with blood. Visitors walk among rows of white crosses, each marking a life given on June 6, 1944, and in the weeks that followed. Time has softened the scars, but the echoes of that day still resound. The invasion of Normandy was not just a feat of arms. It was a triumph of planning, deception, and courage in equal measure. Its lessons reach far beyond the battlefields of France, into the nature of war itself. The power of deception. Perhaps the greatest lesson of D-Day is that wars are not always won by strength alone. They are also won by imagination. Inflatable tanks, fake radio signals, phantom armies. These may seem absurd, even comical. Yet they were deadly serious. They shaped Hitler's decisions, fixed his gaze on Calais, and kept his strongest divisions from Normandy when they were most needed. Operation Bodyguard proved that deception can save lives. Every German tank that sat idle near Calais was one less on the beaches of Omaha. Every hour that Hitler hesitated was another hour for the Allies to strengthen their foothold. In the end, illusion and shadow were as powerful as steel and fire. The value of intelligence. Another lesson lies in the quiet huts of Bletchley Park. The codebreakers who deciphered Enigma gave the Allies not only knowledge, but confidence. They could see into the mind of their enemy. They knew when deception had taken root, when lies had become truth in the German command. In war, information is as valuable as ammunition. The men and women who worked in silence with pencils, machines, and typewriters helped win D-Day as surely as those who carried rifles ashore. The role of chance. D-Day was also a reminder of the role of chance in history. Had the weather not broken, the invasion might have been postponed for weeks. Had James Stagg misjudged his forecast, the fleet could have sailed into disaster. The line between triumph and catastrophe was as thin as a cloud bank over the Channel. Even the best-laid plans must bend to fate. On June 6, fortune favored the Allies, but it was a fortune seized through boldness and preparation. Eisenhower's decision to go, despite uncertainty, was one of the most courageous gambles of the war. The human cost. None of this should obscure the human price. Deception may have saved divisions, but it did not spare those who faced the guns on the beaches. Thousands died before Normandy was secured. Many more would fall in the hedgerows, the towns, the fields of France. For the men who survived, memories of D-Day remained etched in their souls. The roar of engines, the scream of shells, the faces of comrades lost. Their courage gave substance to the illusions woven in shadows. Without their sacrifice, deception alone would have meant nothing. D-Day's legacy. In the decades since 1944, militaries around the world have studied D-Day for its lessons in planning, logistics, and courage. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is the reminder that wars are fought not only on battlefields, but in the mind. From psychological warfare to cyber deception, the principles of Operation Bodyguard echo in modern conflicts. To shape what the enemy believes is to shape what the enemy does. And sometimes, what the enemy believes can be more decisive than what is true. A day that changed the world. On June 6, 1944, the tide of history turned. The beaches of Normandy became the gateway to liberation. The deception of Calais became the downfall of German strategy. The courage of ordinary men became the foundation of victory. As one Allied veteran later said, "We weren't heroes. We were scared, cold, and seasick. But we knew we had a job to do. And we did it." D-Day endures because it was not just a military operation. It was a testament to what can be achieved when imagination, intelligence, and courage unite. Closing reflection. The ghosts of deception, Garbo's phantom agents, Patton's rubber tanks, the inflatable armies of Kent, will never be listed among the divisions that fought in Normandy. Yet they marched alongside the real soldiers in spirit, clearing the way, sowing confusion, and protecting lives. The lesson is simple, but profound. Truth may win wars, but lies can win them faster. And so, on that longest day, when steel met steel on the shores of France, it was not only bullets and bombs that carried the Allies forward. It was also whispers, shadows, and illusions, an invisible army that made victory possible. For decades, many of the key players in the deception lived quietly in obscurity. Juan Pugil Garcia, Agent Garbo, ended up running a small bookshop in Venezuela. Few knew he had been decorated by both Germany and Britain for the same war. When historians tracked him down in the 1980s, he was astonished to learn he had become a legend. "I only did what I thought was necessary," he said. For the veterans who stormed the beaches, D-Day remained the defining moment of their lives. An American paratrooper, interviewed at age 80, said, "Every night I still hear the jumpmaster's voice. Stand up, hook up, check equipment." Then the wind rushing past, and the darkness. You never forget. French villagers, too, carried the memories. One survivor from Normandy recalled, "We cheered the Allies, but we also buried our neighbors." Liberation was joy and sorrow mixed together. Looking back, the blend of courage and deception that defined D-Day still resonates. Military academies study it as a textbook case of psychological warfare. Yet beyond the theories are human truths: fear, sacrifice, ingenuity, and hope. As one Canadian veteran put it simply, "We didn't know about the spies, or the fake tanks, or the weather forecasts. All we knew was that we had to get off that beach. The rest, well, that was history's secret."